must be within the reach of common abilities, and some degree of industry. Dr. Adams was much pleased with Johnson's design to employ his talents in that manner, being confident he would have attained to great eminence; and indeed I cannot conceive a man better qualified to make a distinguished figure as a lawyer; for he would have brought to his profession a rich store of various knowledge, an uncommon acuteness, and a command of language in which few could have equalled, and none have surpassed him. He who could display eloquence and wit in defence of the decision of the House of Commons upon Mr. Wilkes's election for Middlesex, and of the unconstitutional taxation of our fellow subjects in America, must have been a powerful advocate in any cause. But here also the want of a degree was an insurmountable bar. He was, therefore, under the necessity of persevering in that course into which he had been forced, and we find that his proposal from Greenwich to Mr. Cave for a translation of Father Paul Sarpi's history was accepted. Some sheets of this translation were printed off, but the design was dropped, for it happened, oddly enough, that another person of the name of Samuel Johnson, librarian of St. Martin's in the Fields, and curate of that parish, engaged in the same undertaking, and was patronized by the clergy, particularly by Dr. Pierce, afterwards Bishop of Rochester. Several light skirmishes passed between the rival translators in the newspapers of the day, and the consequence was that they destroyed each other, for neither of them went on with the work. It is much to be regretted that the able performance of that celebrated genius, Fra Paolo, lost the advantage of being incorporated into British literature by the masterly hand of Johnson. I have in my possession, by the favour of Mr. John Nichols, a paper in Johnson's handwriting, entitled, Account between Mr. Edward Cave and Sam Johnson in relation to a version of Father Paul, etc., begun August the 2nd, 1738, by which it appears that from that day to the 21st of April, 1739, Johnson received for this work £49 7s, in sums of 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 4 guineas at a time, most frequently 2. And it is curious to observe the minute and scrupulous accuracy with which Johnson has pasted upon it a slip of paper, which he has entitled Small Account, and which contains one article: September 9th, Mr. Cave laid down 2s. 6d. There is subjoined to this account a list of some subscribers to the work, partly in Johnson's handwriting, partly in that of another person, and there follows a leaf or two on which are written a number of characters which have the appearance of a shorthand, which, perhaps, Johnson was then trying to learn. To Mr. Cave. Wednesday. Sir, I did not care to detain your servant while I wrote an answer to your letter, in which you seem to insinuate that I have promised more than I am ready to perform. If I have raised your expectations by anything that may have escaped my memory, I am sorry, and if you remind me of it, shall thank you for the favour. If I made fewer alterations than usual in the debates, it was only because there appeared, and still appears to be, less need of alteration. The verses to Lady Farbrace may be had when you please, for you know that such a subject neither deserves much thought, nor requires it. The Chinese stories may be had folded down when you please to send, in which I do not recollect that you desired any alterations to be made. An answer to another query I am very willing to write, and had consulted with you about it last night if there had been time, for I think it the most proper way of inviting such a correspondence as may be an advantage to the paper, not a load upon it. As to the prize verses, a backwardness to determine their degrees of merit is not peculiar to me. You may, if you please, still have what I can say, but I shall engage with little spirit in an affair which I shall hardly end to my own satisfaction, and certainly not to the satisfaction of the parties concerned. As to Father Paul, I have not yet been just to my proposal, but have met with impediments which, I hope, are now at an end, and if you find the progress hereafter not such as you have a right to expect, you can easily stimulate a negligent translator. If any or all of these have contributed to your discontent, I will endeavour to remove it, and desire you to propose the question to which you wish for an answer. I am, Sir, your humble servant, Sam Johnson. To Mr. Cave. No date. Sir, I am pretty much of your opinion that the commentary cannot be prosecuted with any appearance of success, for as the names of the authors concerned are of more weight in the performance than its own intrinsic merit, the public will be soon satisfied with it, and I think the examen should be pushed forward with the utmost expedition. Thus, this day, etc., an examen of Mr. Pope's essay, etc., containing a succinct account of the philosophy of Mr. Leibnitz on the system of the fatalists, with a confutation of their opinions, and an illustration of the doctrine of free will, with what else you think proper. It will above all be necessary to take notice that it is a thing distinct from the commentary. I was so far from imagining they stood still, that I conceived them to have a good deal beforehand, and therefore was less anxious in providing them more. But if ever they stand still on my account, it must doubtless be charged to me, and whatever else shall be reasonable I shall not oppose, but beg a suspense of judgment till morning, when I must entreat you to send me 12 proposals, and you shall then have copy to spare. I am, Sir, yours in Pransus, Sam Johnson. Pray muster up the proposals if you can, or let the boy recall them from the booksellers. But although he corresponded with Mr. Cave concerning a translation of Crousaz's examen of Pope's Essay on Man, and gave advice as one anxious for its success, I was long ago convinced by a perusal of the preface that this translation was erroneously ascribed to him, and I have found this point ascertained, beyond all doubt, by the following article in Dr. Birch's manuscripts in the British Museum: Elisae Carterae SPD Thomas Birch. Versionem tuam examinis Crusaziani jam perlegi, summum stili et elegantiam et in re difficilima proprietatem admiratus. Dabam, November 27th, 1738. Indeed, Mrs. Carter has lately acknowledged to Mr. Seward that she was the translator of the examen. It is remarkable that Johnson's last quoted letter to Mr. Cave concludes with a fair confession that he had not a dinner; and it is no less remarkable that though in this state of want himself, his benevolent heart was not insensible to the necessities of an humble labourer in literature, as appears from the very next letter. To Mr. Cave. No date. Dear Sir, you may remember I have formerly talked with you about a military dictionary. The eldest Mr. Macbean, who was with Mr. Chambers, has very good materials for such a work which I have seen, and will do it at a very low rate. I think the terms of war and navigation might be comprised, with good explanations, in 1 8vo pica, which he is willing to do for 12 shillings a sheet, to be made up a guinea at the second impression. If you think on it, I will wait on you with him. I am, Sir, your humble servant, Sam Johnson. Pray lend me Topsail on Animals. I must not omit to mention that this Mr. Macbean was a native of Scotland. In the Gentleman's Magazine of this year, Johnson gave a life of Father Paul, and he wrote the preface to the volume, which, though prefixed to it when bound, is always published with the appendix, and is therefore the last composition belonging to it. The ability and nice adaptation with which he could draw up a prefatory address was one of his peculiar excellencies. It appears, too, that he paid a friendly attention to Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, for in a letter from Mr. Cave to Dr. Birch, November 28th this year, I find Mr. Johnson advises Miss C. to undertake a translation of Boethius de Corn, because there is prose and verse, and to put a name to it when published. This advice was not followed, probably from an apprehension that the work was not sufficiently popular for an extensive sale. How well Johnson himself could have executed a translation of this philosophical poet, we may judge from the following specimen